before began. What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. And if you find comfort in these slow, strange wanderings through the past, feel free to subscribe. It helps keep the stories drifting quietly forever. Now, just let the noise fall away. We begin not in war, not in majesty, but in the morning, because even kings wake up, and how they did was often the strangest part of all. Imagine you are in a stone chamber, damp, heavy with dust, perfumed not by incense or luxury, but by centuries of fire, soot, and the sour weight of old linen. This is a royal bedchamber, not the fairy tale kind. The mattress is stuffed with hay, or wool, or goose feathers, if the king was lucky and the geese were generous. Sheets, yes, but made of linen so stiff it sometimes left patterns on skin. There is no privacy, because even sleep was not a private act. A medieval king rarely woke alone. Attendants would be present before his eyes even opened. Some slept in the same room. Others waited just beyond the wooden screen. They were called valets de chambre, trusted men, but not too trusted, because no royal ever trusted completely. The moment the king stirred, the ritual began. First, water, warmed in copper basins and poured carefully over his hands. He did not wash himself. That was the job of others. Sometimes it took 3 men just to clean his feet. Then came prayers, whispered in Latin, sometimes by the king himself, often by a chaplain kneeling beside the bed. And finally, the garments, layer upon layer upon layer, wool, silk, sometimes fur if it was winter, and under it all, a shirt called a chemise, often worn until it nearly fused with the skin, because laundry was rare. Royalty, it seems, smelled more like peasants than poets imagine. Now, the strangest part, every step of this morning ritual was public. Noblemen watched, foreign envoys observed. In France, under Louis the Nasty, even commoners were allowed to witness the royal dressing on certain feast days, a reminder of how order flowed from the body of the king. The monarch's body was a performance, a symbol, a machine of divine authority. And this performance didn't end once the dressing was done, because next came the movement through the castle. And this was not free. No, king simply strolled. His steps were choreographed. Great chain of advisors, guards, pages, and messengers moved with him, like iron filings around a magnet. In England, under Henry III, the king's movement from his bedchamber to the council hall was sometimes accompanied by trumpeters, not for fanfare, but to warn servants to clear the way, because royalty should not step around peasants. Peasants should vanish, even indoors, even in silence. And now we step into one of the most peculiar corners of royal life, the toilet, or rather, the lack of one. Medieval castles did not have modern plumbing, Even by the standards of their own time, royal waste rituals were strange. The king's excrement was collected, not immediately disposed of. It was sometimes inspected. Doctors believed health could be determined by the color, shape, and smell of what the king produced. This duty fell to a man with one of the most prestigious, if least pleasant, jobs in the kingdom, the groom of the stool. In England, the groom was a noble, a trusted confidant. His role? To assist the king in relieving himself, to keep the privy clean, to help undress and redress, and to keep detailed notes of the king's digestive health. These notes were sometimes encrypted because royal digestion was a state secret. And yes, the groom often had the king's ear because no one else was allowed in the privy. No advisors, no spies, no bishops, just one man and the monarch, in privacy that did not exist anywhere else. The groom became often the most powerful whisperer in the realm. Is that strange? Yes, but what is power, if not strange? Let your breath settle now. Let the wind outside your mind soften. We are not done yet. Royal life was not all performance and politics. It was boredom, too. Endless, aching boredom. Days spent listening to petitions, watching, hawking demonstrations, attending feasts that lasted 10 hours. Feasts where meat bled and bread hardened before it could be touched. And no, kings did not always eat first. Sometimes the meal was staged for show. The king would sit and watch while a roast boar was carved, blessed, paraded, and removed. Only after the ritual was done could the actual eating begin. Meals were performances, and so were dreams. Royal dreams were recorded, analyzed. A bad dream was not just a worry, it was a threat. Monarchs consulted astrologers, monks, even poets to decipher the symbols in their sleep. One king dreamed of a burning tower and ordered all torches removed from the castle. Another saw 3 dogs devour his foot and banned hunting for a year. And in Byzantium, dreams were sometimes staged. Yes, staged. Chambers filled with aromatic smoke, murmuring chants, soft lights, so that sleep became theater, and the dreams could be steered. Royalty, after all, should not dream like peasants. They should dream of stars, of glory, of divine confirmation. Even in sleep, hierarchy persisted. Let that idea float. Soft, ridiculous, and entirely real. Now, let us walk outside into the royal gardens. They were not places of joy. They were places of control. A rose was not just a rose. It was trimmed into submission, walled, ordered, kept. Royalty saw nature not as beauty, but as threat. The forests outside the palace were dark, filled with wolves, and worse, with freedom. Peasants lived there, bandits roamed there. So kings built gardens to tame the green, and strolled through them, not to relax, but to remind themselves that even trees could be ruled. In France, it was said that King Charles II walked his garden in silence for hours, not speaking, not waving, just walking in perfect squares, each footstep echoing control, even as his mind slipped into madness. Because, yes, royalty broke too, more often than stories say. Madness among kings was not rare, but it was hidden, masked with rituals, wrapped in silk and titles. Some kings spoke to ghosts. Some believed they were made of glass. One believed he had swallowed a sacred jewel and refused to eat for days, and no one could stop them, because to stop them was to admit they were not divine, and to admit that was death. So the rituals went on. The attendants bowed, the courtiers smiled, and the king, broken or not, ruled. Let that thought settle. Let your thoughts move like water under stone. Soft, directionless, there is still so much more to see. The weird life of royalty was not just strange, it was fragile. Tomorrow, we'll open their letters, sit in their baths, step into their coronation dreams. But for now, just breathe and drift, because the weirdest thing of all is how the world once turned on the breath of a man who never walked alone. The doors never truly closed, not in the way we imagine today, with privacy, solitude, or silence. In a medieval palace, the door was not a boundary, it was a threshold, and beyond it, waited performance. Royal letters were not simply words on parchment, they were declarations of self, of lineage, of identity. They were weapons, and they were often written in the voice of God, not because kings believed they were divine, though some did, but because they had to act like it. So their scribes took quills, sharpened from the feathers of swans, dipped them in iron gall ink, and wrote in a hand so precise it could take hours to shape a single line. The salutation alone could span a paragraph. We, by the grace of the Most High, protector of realms, guardian of the true faith, sovereign of the known world, do hereby decree. And that was just hello. The letter might not contain much at all, perhaps a request for grain, or a reminder that taxes were overdue. But it would be wrapped in layers of ceremony, folded like an origami of authority, sealed with wax, pressed with a signet ring carved from stone older than the crown, and scented, yes, scented, because letters carried the king's presence, and it was important they smelled like it, not of sweat, not of dust, but of lavender, cloves, rosemary, or ambergris, the scent of a whale's ghost drifting through parchment. It wasn't just letters. Royal gifts, too, were strange, not generous, always, but strategic. One king gifted a rival a live leopard, not for friendship, but because feeding a leopard and housing it and guarding it could bankrupt a small court. Another king sent a severed hawk's wing dipped in gold, a reminder that his birds hunted beyond borders. And once, a queen sent her sister a pair of gloves made from human skin, the tanned hide of a rebel executed the week before. It was both a gift and a warning. The sister never visited again. The palace, you see, was not just walls. It was message. It was theater. Even the floors spoke. In the courts of Castile, floors were painted with images of beasts, lions and dragons, with eyes that watched those who walked. It was said no one could lie on those floors, because the beasts would remember, and in Hungary, the tiles bore blessings in Latin, glazed into their surface, so that each step invoked divine protection or divine wrath, depending on the route taken. Now let us step into another peculiar corner of royal life, the bath. A rare thing, but when it happened, it was a spectacle. Royal baths were not short. They were events. Tubs were carved from marble or hammered copper, set near hearths to keep the air warm and filled with herbs, thyme for cleansing, mint for spirit, rose petals for the illusion of purity, and the water, rarely hot, but never cold. It took hours to prepare. Servants boiled cauldrons and poured them into the tub by the dozen. The king or queen would enter surrounded not by silence, but by song. Musicians often played, sometimes psalms, sometimes flutes. The bath might last 2 hours, during which petitions were read aloud, decisions made, blessings granted, and then the drying, not with towels, but with sheets of fine linen, each used once, sometimes heated, sometimes scented with orange peel and crushed juniper. One English queen was dried with cloths embroidered with her family's coat of arms. She said it reminded her of who she was, even in nakedness. The bath was followed by massage, not for pleasure, but to restore humors, because they believed heat moved the bile in the body, and that touching the right pressure points could balance the elements within. A misstep, they feared, could turn the king melancholic. So it was done with ritual, with prayer, with silence, and still the king rarely bathed more than once a month, because to be too clean was suspicious. It suggested vanity, or worse, softness. Now, the oddest thing of all, the royal calendar, because the king's year was not like ours. It was not linear, it was circular, built around feasts, saints' days, celestial omens. Each day had its own rules. One day, no meat. Another, no shoes. Another, no speaking after sundown. And these were not always observed for faith, but for superstition. A king might fast on Tuesdays because his grandfather died on a Tuesday, or he might refuse to wear green because a comet once appeared while he wore green, and comets meant disaster. Astrologers played a major role, charting the stars, calculating the angles, predicting harvest, war, even birth. A royal child born under the wrong moon was sometimes hidden, not killed, but declared missing, and replaced with a cousin born under better skies. They said it was for the realm, that the heavens must bless the crown. That blood alone was not enough. And so, In the royal nursery, babies were not named until the stars approved. Sometimes that meant weeks or even months, during which the child was referred to only by title: the little hope, the silent rose, the tiny king. Some died before names came, and the court mourned them without ever calling them by name. Let your breath soften now. Let the strangeness ripple like wind on a deep water. We now open a door most closed tightly. Royal madness, more common than we are told, and more peculiar in its expression. One monarch believed his bones were made of wax. He refused to sit, fearing he would melt. He stood for 3 days before collapsing. Another believed he could see angels behind everyone's left shoulder, and so he passed laws requiring courtiers to only stand to his right. One queen ordered all mirrors removed. She believed her reflection stole her words. For years, no glass was allowed near her. Letters were read to her instead, and she responded with gestures, because even her voice, she believed, could be stolen. These were not eccentricities. They were accepted as divine burdens, proof that royalty lived closer to heaven, and heaven, they believed, was strange. So madness was not always treated. It was absorbed, wrapped in ceremony, disguised as holiness. And those who served the mad king or queen often became mad themselves, not from disease, but from pretending it wasn't there. One servant wrote that he forgot how to speak plainly, for I have lied in smiles for too many seasons. The court was a place of beauty, yes, but also of masks, of rituals so tight they bent the soul, of games that began in childhood and never ended. Royal children played with ivory dice carved with saints' faces. They raced snails, not horses. They played a game called Whisper the Law, in which one child made up a new law and the others had to obey it for the rest of the day. One prince once declared that no one could walk forward, all must walk backward. The game lasted a week. No one dared stop it, because even play was prophecy. What a child commanded today, they might enforce tomorrow. So games were watched carefully, analyzed, interpreted, and sometimes repeated in court. Once that child ruled. A king once outlawed the color yellow because his brother wore it during a game of Whisper the Law. Let that absurdity settle. Let your thoughts float. There is nothing to hold on to here. Only drift. Only the gentle pull of old, soft strangeness. There is more to see, more to remember, more to forget. But for now, you don't need to follow every word. You don't need to understand. You just need to breathe and know that behind every crown was something quietly broken and something even more quietly beautiful. Not every royal lived in a palace of stone. Some moved constantly, from a manor to abbey to hunting lodge and back again, not for luxury, but because medieval castles were not built for comfort. They were built for rule, for defense, for display, but not for staying. The king's court was not fixed. It wandered, dragging with it hundreds of carts, scrolls, candles, goblets, herbs, spare shoes, chickens, barrels of salted fish, beds, altar cloths, bells, all of it moved with the crown, and every arrival was an ordeal. Villages were warned weeks in advance, bakers were summoned, animals slaughtered, walls painted, because the presence of royalty was not a visit, it was a reckoning. There were rules. The king could not sleep in a room where a commoner had slept within the past year. The queen could not eat food that had not been prayed over by two priests. No one could wear brighter colors than the monarch. No one could walk beside him, only behind. Except for dogs. Royal dogs had special status. Some wore collars lined with velvet. Others had their own pages, young boys whose only task was to feed and bathe the hounds. One French duke had his dogs dressed in miniature capes during public events. The hounds sat beside him at feasts. They were allowed to bark during speeches. People were not. Now drift a little deeper. We come to the subject of sleep. Royal beds were wide, very wide, not for comfort, but because kings rarely slept alone, not romantically, but politically. Nobles were sometimes invited to sleep in the king's bed to show trust. It was a sign of favor and a kind of surveillance, a way for the king to measure loyalty by the rhythm of another man's breath. Some slept at the foot, some slept upright. It was not restful, but it was respected. Royal children were not exempt. They were trained to sleep lightly, to wake at the sound of bells, to pray before dreaming, and to sleep in silence. Crying was discouraged. If a prince cried too often, he was taken to a cold chapel to listen for God. If he cried there too, he was considered unready. Sometimes he was sent to live with monks for a season. Silence was a royal virtue, but perhaps the strangest part of royal sleep was the belief in sleepwalkers. It was said that kings who walked in their sleep were being guided by angels. They were never stopped, only watched, and sometimes followed. One servant once followed a sleepwalking king into the armory. The king picked up a sword, walked to the chapel, laid it at the altar, and returned to bed. In the morning, he was told, he declared war because he believed the angels had chosen his enemy. Let that logic fade. You don't need to understand it. Just drift in it. Now we step into ceremony, crowning rituals, weddings, baptisms, events not just of faith, but of architecture, because they required structures to be built and unbuilt, platforms, thrones, archways of flowers and wheat, and all of it temporary. A coronation might take a year to plan and a day to forget, except for the oil, always the oil. Royalty was not just crowned, they were anointed with sacred oil said to have descended from heaven. In France, the vial was kept by monks, hidden in stone, only opened during coronation, and only touched by gloves. It smelled of cinnamon, balm, olive, and blood. It was believed to carry the Holy Spirit. Some said it burned when touched by an unworthy man. Others said it healed wounds when rubbed on battlefields. It was not oil, it was God. When a king was anointed, he became untouchable, not metaphorically, literally. No one could touch him without permission. His robes were cut so that his skin never met the world. He did not touch doorknobs. He did not hold spoons. He did not even scratch an itch without a servant's help, because that skin had been blessed. It was holy. It was sealed. And so, ironically, royalty became fragile. To protect the sacred body, the world had to be filtered, rooms cleaned thrice, food tasted 4 times, wine tested with silver pins, which turned black if poison was near, or so they believed. Some kings surrounded themselves with dwarfs, not for amusement, but for omen. They believed that dwarfs could see evil spirits, that they could warn of illness or betrayal. One queen traveled with a pet goose, not for comfort, but because she believed its honking would reveal liars. She was said to watch guests closely when the goose was in the room. If it squawked, she dismissed them, and they were rarely seen again. Now breathe, let it slow. There's more, always more. Let's drift to the royal wardrobe, a realm of its own. Clothing was not fashion, it was hierarchy. Each piece weighed carefully. Some robes had gemstones sewn inside, not to show, but to press against the skin, to remind the wearer of the weight of rule. A crown, too, was not light. It could weigh as much as 10 pounds, heavy with gold, with sapphires from Sri Lanka, with emeralds from Persian mines. It left bruises on the brow. One prince once fainted during coronation. He was not ill, just heavy. The weight of the crown had bent his neck until the world tilted. He stood again, because he had to, because everyone was watching, even the birds. Yes, even they had a role. Pigeons trained to circle the cathedral at key moments. Owls tethered to branches to symbolize wisdom. Peacocks caged beside banquet halls, their feathers plucked and worn by high nobles during processions. Nothing was natural. Everything was arranged, even the sky. One king ordered that mirrors be placed on the roof of the chapel to catch starlight and reflect it onto the throne. He believed it made his decisions divine. Another demanded that no one sneeze in his presence. He believed sneezing expelled one's soul, and a man without a soul could not be trusted. So sneezes were punished with fasting, or silence, or exile. It sounds absurd, but to them it was law, because royalty was not just bloodline, it was belief, a structure of magic made solid and sustained by fear. Let that truth settle. We walk now to the royal treasury, where the strangest objects were kept, not just coins, but teeth of saints, of ancestors, of enemies. One king kept the preserved hand of a rebel in a silver case. He touched it before signing new laws. Another collected broken arrows, each labeled with the name of the man it failed to kill. He believed these arrows gave him luck, and one queen kept locks of her own hair cut each year on the same date. She said it marked time more truly than calendars. She stored them in jars labeled by year, by mood, by weather, her library of self, quiet, private, and completely strange. But then, all royalty was strange, because it had to be. It had to be set apart, made alien, made unreachable, so that people could believe in it, and fear it, and never fully understand it. Even now, we don't. We remember the robes, the gold, the names, but not the whispers, not the broken sleep, not the goose in the corridor, not the pressure behind the eyes from the weight of too much watching. But you remember now, in this moment, in this quiet. Let the memories fall like ash. Let the strangeness curl around you like mist. There are still royal shadows left to follow, still secrets sewn in silk, still footsteps in halls that never echoed quite right. But for now, let it all fade and drift. There were rules, but not the kind written down, not the kind proclaimed from balconies. These were softer, older, held in glances, in footsteps, in the tight pull of a curtain at the wrong hour. And nowhere were these rules stranger than in the royal kitchens. Let us enter quietly. It is before dawn. Smoke already rises through the flues, winding through the stone, like breath from some ancient beast. There are no cookbooks, no recipes, only memory and fear. The royal kitchen was a kingdom unto itself. Dozens of men, each assigned to a single task. One for dough, one for broth, one to chop, one to smell. Yes, smell. The nose was a man whose sole duty was to test the scent of every ingredient. He could not read, he did not write, but he was feared more than the cook, because one bad smell and everything stopped. Food was sacred, not because it was holy, but because it could kill, and because it had to impress. The king's meal might take a day to prepare, not because it was complicated, but because it was watched. Every egg broken was recorded, every pinch of spice noted. Salt was weighed by the grain, because too much meant deceit, and too little meant insult. Poison was the oldest royal language, and everyone knew it. So the taster came first. A man, sometimes a eunuch, sometimes a priest, ate a small bite of everything, then waited 30 minutes. If he lived, the king ate. If not, the kitchen was burned. Not just closed, burned. Ash washed away suspicion. Let your breath slow. We're still in the kitchen. Now imagine a pie, not a dessert, but a message. It was called a coffin, a crust baked hard as wood, filled not with sweetness, but secrets. Birds, yes, live birds, baked into a hollow shell, then released upon slicing, a spectacle and a warning, because if the birds flew straight, it meant luck. If they scattered, it meant treachery. One king demanded a pie with a single blackbird, trained to land on his shoulder. It did not. It flew into the rafters. He ordered the pie maker exiled, said he'd cooked doubt into the dough, And perhaps he had. Let that image drift now. The pie open, the wings flapping, the court in silence, all of them pretending they understood. Now step outside into the royal menagerie. Animals were not just pets, they were signs, tokens of conquest. A king with an elephant was a king who had seen the world. A queen with a monkey was exotic. A prince with a falcon was feared. But they did not always care for them. Many animals died within weeks. Too cold, too strange, too far from home. One lion was kept in a stone cage beside the treasury because it was said lions could smell gold. Another was chained in the chapel because the king believed it would keep his prayers strong. No one asked what happened when it roared during Mass. They simply kept praying, and one day it stopped because silence was easier. Let your thoughts grow soft again. We drift now to music. Royal musicians did not play for pleasure. They played for command. Every note was a signal. A high trill meant the queen was entering. A long drone meant the king was listening. A short staccato meant silence was expected. These were unspoken rules, learned only by watching. One mistake could mean dismissal, or worse. So musicians played with eyes wide, watching, waiting. One violinist wore a bell around his neck, so the king could always hear when he moved. Another played barefoot, because he believed the king could feel his mood through the floorboards. He was never proven wrong, because no one dared correct him. Royalty sometimes commissioned songs about themselves, but not ballads, whispers, songs to be sung only once, then forgotten. One such song spoke of a queen's beauty so vividly that the king forbade its repetition. He said it gave her too much power, and too much power led to softness. So the song was buried, its words only half remembered. Let that song drift past your ears now. You don't need to hear it, only feel the shadow of it, just as they did. Now come with me to the royal astrologer's chamber, always at the top of a tower, always cold, filled with maps of stars, spheres of bone and brass, candles that never burned too low, because darkness meant doubt. The astrologer was not a wizard, not quite, but he was feared like one, because he could say when not to ride, when not to speak, when not to be born. Yes, he advised on conception, not on how, but on when. Kings were told the exact hour to lie with the queen. If they wished for a son, some obeyed, some did not, but all listened, because if a son was not born, it could not be the king's fault. It was the stars. The sky had always been loyal, and loyalty was currency. So charts were drawn, numbers carved into ivory, dreams interpreted by planetary motion. And if a comet passed, the kingdom held its breath. Even birds were watched, their flight patterns mapped against Mercury's path. One astrologer once claimed a raven's cry meant betrayal in the east. 2 weeks later, a cousin rebelled. The raven was made royal, given a perch near the throne, and fed meat soaked in honey. until it choked, because even loyalty has limits, and even birds die. Let your mind float now. The stars overhead, the floor cool beneath you. Nowhere to go, nothing to prove. Just drift, drift toward the royal physician. He does not carry a bag. He carries a ledger of dreams, of temperatures, of blood-colored cloths, because symptoms were not seen, they were sensed. A pale king might be melancholic, or enchanted, or both. The physician would prescribe bleeding, or figs, or time alone in a room of blue walls. Color mattered. Certain shades were forbidden during illness, because they angered the humors. A green robe might worsen a cough. A gold ring might heal a boil. It sounds strange, but then everything was strange. One physician brewed potions with crushed emeralds. Another used spider webs soaked in vinegar. Another swore by roasted mouse lungs. The king drank them all, because not drinking was rebellion, and even rebellion must taste bitter. Now we drift to the queen, often silent, often still, but always watching. Royal queens were trained not in power, but in poise. How to stand, how to breathe, how to smile for exactly 3 seconds. Any longer, and it suggested hunger. Any shorter, and it suggested fear. Queens walked with books on their heads, not to learn, but to balance. Because a stumbling queen meant instability, and instability meant war. One queen trained her daughters to curtsy until their knees bled. She said grace required sacrifice, and sacrifice required silence. Queens were painted in oils, with eyes too large, hands too soft, because truth was not beautiful, and beauty was expected. But not all queens were quiet. Some ruled through letters, others through marriage. One queen had 15 godchildren, all nobles, all sworn to her in secret. She called them her silent court, and they moved more powerfully than armies, not with swords, but with presence, because presence was power, and royalty had learned that long ago. Let that presence rest on your chest now, not heavy, just warm, the way candlelight rests on a stone wall. There are more stories, more weirdness to explore, more silence stitched into velvet. But for now, let it all fade. Let your eyes soften. Let your thoughts blur. You don't need to understand royalty. You only need to feel how strange it was, and how, somewhere inside that strangeness, the world still turns. Some thrones were never sat upon, not because they were forgotten, but because they were too sacred to be used. In medieval Sicily, a ceremonial throne was carved from black volcanic rock. It stood at the center of a room lined with gold leaf vines. The king would enter, circle it slowly, bow, and leave. To sit upon it would be to challenge heaven. In other kingdoms, thrones were built so high they required steps, but those steps were not always for climbing. They were for ceremony. The act of stepping upward, slowly, was watched by dozens, each rise a symbol of rising closer to divine purpose. The king did not simply sit, he ascended. The throne was not furniture, it was a sermon, and in some courts, the throne was guarded, not by men, but by animals, carved in stone, lions, sphinxes, winged horses, each one with a meaning: the lion for justice, the horse for swiftness, the sphinx for silence, because a king who could not keep a secret could not keep a kingdom. Let that linger, let the dust settle on that image, and now let us turn to something far stranger: royal punishment, not of others, but of themselves. Some kings practiced ritual flagellation. They whipped their own backs in private chapels, not for sin, but for clarity. They believed pain opened the mind to divine thought. One king struck himself before every major decision. He said the sting cleared the noise from his ears. Another wore a shirt made from coarse hair, so that every movement reminded him of mortality. These were not madmen, they were kings, and they believed that suffering made the soul sharp. Queens, too, had their rituals. One queen fasted every full moon. She believed it kept her womb pure. Another never slept in the same bed twice in a row. She believed dreams would rot if they returned to the same place. And so she moved, room to room, chamber to chamber, each one with a different scent: lavender, myrrh, burnt cedar. She named the rooms after saints and assigned each a word: mercy, silence, fire, fog. She never explained why. Now we step into the strange world of royal pets. Not just dogs and falcons, but stranger companions. A Danish king kept a herd of white deer. They lived within castle walls and wore bells. At night, they were led into the throne room, not for show, but for sound. Their bells rang while the king read poetry. He said it helped him hear the rhythm. An English queen had a swarm of bees. They lived in a carved wooden hive shaped like a cathedral. She believed they carried her prayers. No one dared disturb them. They stung a bishop once. The queen said it meant he was guilty. He was not seen again. In Bohemia, a prince raised a raven from birth. It followed him into council chambers, sat on his shoulder during battle, and was given its own tomb when it died. The prince wept for 3 days. He wore black for a month and declared no one else could say the bird's name. We do not know what it was. Some secrets remained secrets. Let your breath fall into a rhythm now, like footfalls in an empty corridor. Soft, measured, still moving. Now we visit the royal crypts. Not the grand tombs made of marble and light, but the older ones, the forgotten ones, beneath the stone, beneath the chapels, where the air is thick and the silence bends. Royalty feared death, but they also feared being forgotten, so they made their crypts strange. Some had hidden passageways, not for escape, but for secrecy. The path to the body was not straight. It curved, twisted, split, because they believed spirits could not follow a crooked path. Some kings were buried with coins on their eyes, others with swords broken in half. To show that their fight was over, one was buried with a chessboard, pieces placed mid-game. No one knows which move came next. Queens were buried with their wedding veils, even if they had not worn them in decades, because memory, like silk, was fragile. One queen asked to be buried with a vial of tears, collected during her lifetime. She said it was proof she had felt enough. The bottle still exists. No one opens it. Let your thoughts drift with that. Now rise again, not from the grave, but into the court's strangest hall, the Hall of Mirrors, not the one in Versailles, but older ones, narrow, dark, lined with polished metal, not glass. Mirrors were rare. They distorted. They shimmered. They showed the soul, they said, and that made them dangerous. Some courts banned mirrors at night. They said moonlight made them whisper. Others placed them only on ceilings, so that courtiers had to look up to see themselves, because pride, they believed, should require effort. One king filled an entire room with mirrored tiles. He called it the Chamber of Judgment. Anyone summoned there had to remove their shoes, speak only in whispers, and never look themselves in the eye. It was not a punishment. It was a reminder that truth changes depending on the angle. Now come, quietly, into the room where nothing was said, the listening room, used in several courts, especially during tense seasons. It had no windows, only one chair, and a circle of sand on the floor. No one spoke in the room. They wrote on slate. They passed notes, because words could be overheard, but silence could not. The room was swept daily, the sand smoothed, and still, footsteps appeared overnight. No one claimed them. No one asked. It was said that some kings sat there to speak with ghosts, not of the dead, but of the unborn, ideas not yet formed, laws not yet written, futures not yet made. Let your breath deepen. We are nearly, not at the end, but at a fold where past and dream meet, and we come gently to the royal bed once more. But this time, it is the deathbed. Not all kings died in battle or in council. Many died in silence, surrounded not by family, but by watchers, clerks, scribes, surgeons, priests, each with a duty to witness, to record, to pray. The king's breath was counted, his last words preserved, even if they were nonsense, especially if they were nonsense, because nonsense could be prophecy. One king whispered a date. It was carved into the chapel wall and forgotten until it rained blood on that date 50 years later, so they say. Another simply said, the curtain. No one knew what it meant. The curtain was kept, folded, framed, displayed in a gallery no one visits anymore. One queen smiled, then wept, then laughed. She said, the throne is lighter now. And then, nothing. But the strangest end came not from a king or queen, but from a prince who never ruled. He asked to be buried in silence. No bells, no hymns, no stone. He said, the earth remembers what marble forgets. So they gave him to the ground and never spoke his name again. But sometimes, in spring, the flowers in that field bloom early, and people wonder, and walk away quickly because royalty may fade, but the weirdness lingers, not loud, not clear, just always there, in the hush before sleep, in the fold of a robe, in the echo of a footstep no one made. Let it all slow now. You're still here, and the story is still moving, but softer now, like a tide that no longer reaches the shore. Breathe, drift, and know there is still so much strange history left to unfold. Royalty did not always wake with the sun. Some kings preferred twilight. They believed the morning was too loud, too raw. They rose when the stars still lingered, when the air was cool and thin, when the castle's corridors whispered but did not yet speak. Servants called this the shadow hour. Their steps were softer, their hands slower, because the king, during these hours, was more spirit than man, and everything done in his presence had to be quiet, ceremonial, obedient to the breath of night. One monarch in the eastern kingdoms refused to speak before the first bell rang from the monastery tower. He would sit, cloaked in furs, near a flame that was never meant to warm, only to glow, and simply watch. Sometimes he watched the tapestry on the wall, where a stitched lion devoured a stitched lamb. Sometimes he watched his own hands, counting nothing, thinking nothing. Once, he spoke just before the bell and dismissed the guard who flinched. He said that silence, broken before time, was a sign of crumbling order. Another ruler believed dreams were prophecies, and each morning he demanded they be recorded, not his dreams, but the dreams of his servants. They were summoned, bleary-eyed, to describe in detail what shadows they'd seen behind their eyelids. If a servant dreamed of fire, the kitchens were closed for a week. If someone saw a bridge collapsing, all travel was suspended. No one dared to lie, because the wrong dream might bring punishment, but the right dream might bring favor. And sometimes, favor was the most dangerous thing of all. Let that thought ripple and fade. Let it settle behind your eyes like mist behind a veil. Now we pass into the hall of weeping. Not every castle had one, only those ruled by queens who mourned publicly. In those times, grief was a performance, a responsibility, and the hall of weeping was its stage. High ceilings, tapestries dyed in storm gray, windows that filtered light through stained glass, shaped like tears. Here, queens wept for lost kings, for fallen sons, for daughters born still, but not alone. Ladies in waiting were trained to echo her sorrow, a chorus of gentle sobs, rising and falling like the sea. Musicians played dirges on hollow-bellied instruments. Poets recited lines of longing, chosen not for comfort, but for ache. A queen did not cry in silence. Her sorrow had symmetry, it had rhythm, it had purpose, because to cry without beauty was unbecoming. So grief became theater, and after the tears, there was tea, served in cups with silver spoons shaped like feathers, to remind the queen that her spirit could rise again, but never too quickly, because hope that arrived too soon was vulgar. It meant you did not love deeply enough. Let that contradiction drift. And now, walk with me through the royal wardrobe once more, not for dressing, but for disguising, because sometimes royalty wished to be unseen, or to be seen as something else, and so came the ritual of the walk among the people. Cloaks were chosen, hats lowered, mud smeared on boots, accents practiced, stories memorized. One king called himself a traveling cloth merchant. He wandered the city for hours, asking women about the quality of French velvet. Another posed as a monk and begged for bread just to see who would turn him away. A queen once disguised herself as a widow and sat beside the village fountain, listening to gossip about her own rule. She returned to the palace and changed the law, but she never said why. These walks were not always safe. Some royals were recognized, some were followed. One prince vanished during such a walk and was never found. It was said he had simply walked too far into a story he could not escape. His mother kept his disguise. The boots, the rough cloak, the wooden flute, sealed in a chest. She said he was not lost, just listening. Let that soften your pulse. Let it blur the edges of time. Now we enter the royal men's gallery, not for art, but for laughter. And not joyful laughter, mockery. This was the room where courtiers gathered to insult one another in verse, a tradition known as courtly sparring. It was ritual, a competition. Each noble took turns, reciting poems that ridiculed the others, their lineage, their posture, their choices in jewels. But it had rules. No mention of mothers, no mention of disease, and the last line must always rhyme with honor, a kind of poetic armor. The king watched in silence, judging who was clever and who was simply cruel. The winner was given a golden quill. The loser was sent to the kitchens for a month to peel onions until they wept for real. One man, after losing 3 rounds, wrote no more. He became a monk. He said the Lord did not rhyme. But the strangest rule? You could never laugh at your own joke. If you did, you were whipped with ribbons, not to hurt, but to shame, because royalty valued restraint, even in jest. Let the echoes of that room vanish now, laughter turning to dust. Now drift lower to the palace archives, but not the ones with laws and treaties. The other archives, the ones of secrets. Each court had them, rooms filled with scrolls never meant to be read, accounts of forbidden births, confessions from spies, drawings of symbols that only one man understood, and he had died a century ago. These archives were tended by one person only, the keeper, always hooded, always silent, sometimes a eunuch, sometimes a blind woman with hands like bird claws. They did not speak to anyone. They recorded in codes. They locked the door with 3 keys, each held by a different person in the kingdom. No one knew everything, only the keeper. And the keeper never left the palace. They ate alone, slept beside the scrolls, and when they died, their replacement was chosen by the shape of their dreams. No one spoke of the archives aloud, but everyone feared them, because once a man tried to burn them. He vanished before the fire reached the door. They say his name still smolders in the walls. Now we rise slowly into the Queen's Hall of Echoes, a room designed with curved walls and domed ceilings, where even a whisper returns 3 times. It was used during moments of doubt. When the Queen questioned a decision, she would stand in the center and speak her thought, and the room would answer. Her voice returned softer, changed. She believed the echoes were her truer self, less proud, less afraid. One queen used the hall daily. She made no choices without it. Her courtiers began to mimic it, repeating her orders 3 times before moving, not for clarity, but for ritual. And when she died, the room was sealed, because without her voice, it was just stone. Now drift again to the place no one wanted to speak of, the whispered wing, a part of the castle where madness lived, not hidden, but softened, a wing for the royal family members who did not fit, the cousin who believed he was made of crystal, the aunt who only spoke to mirrors, the boy who claimed he could smell lies. They were not imprisoned, but they were watched, cared for, given rooms with blue walls and white birds painted on the ceiling, given books with no endings, songs with no melodies, given the silence they needed, and sometimes they returned. One girl emerged after a decade, quiet but clear. She became an advisor to the queen, said very little, but when she spoke, everyone listened, because sometimes madness is just a different kind of clarity. Let that thought rest behind your eyes and let it go, because the story will keep going, even when you're no longer listening, even when you're drifting so far into quiet that the words blur and melt. This life, this strange, royal, echoing life, is not meant to be understood, only floated through, like music with no end, like a hallway that turns forever. And you are already halfway there. So rest, and I will keep the story moving. There were keys that opened nothing, silver ones, worn around royal necks, gold ones, passed from queen to queen, with no lock to match. They were ceremonial, but no one dared call them that, because in the medieval world, a key was never just a tool. It was a symbol of control, of silence, of things best left unseen. One duchess wore a chain of 7 keys. When asked what they opened, she smiled and said, "Patience." Some said she'd once locked a man inside a room of mirrors until he forgot who he was. Others said the keys were to her heart, and no one was brave enough to test the metaphor. Let that metallic weight settle behind your ribs. We drift now into the royal etiquette chamber, a place not for ruling, but for learning how to exist in the presence of greatness. It was here that young nobles were taught how to bow, how to stand, how to breathe. You were not to exhale too deeply in the presence of royalty, because a sigh could be misread as grief or disagreement, or worse, boredom. and boredom was dangerous. So, children were trained to be interested in everything: the folding of napkins, the curvature of fruit, the proper width between fork and knife. There was a scroll, a long scroll. It listed forbidden movements: blinking too rapidly, scratching the nose, adjusting the sleeve more than twice in 1 hour. Each had meaning. Each could cause offense. One young page was sent away for fidgeting with his ring. He claimed it was stuck. The queen claimed he was signaling to someone unseen. He vanished from court the next morning. Let that etiquette dissolve now. It was never made for comfort, only control. We slip now into the royal garden of night, a garden tended only under moonlight, by gloved hands. In silence, its plants were chosen not for beauty, but for meaning: night blooming jasmine for secrecy, mandrake root for dreams, a single vine of belladonna not to be touched, only watched. The royal family walked the paths barefoot to hear the earth speak. The gardeners were monks, not sworn by faith, but by ritual. Each plant had a name. Each branch was turned in a specific direction, because even leaves were not allowed to grow freely. A king once plucked a white flower and placed it behind his ear. The next day, he ordered 3 knights to the front. He said the flower told him who was brave. No one understood, but the order was obeyed, and the flower was returned to the soil with a prayer. Drift with that, softly. Now we enter the whisper hall, a long corridor with uneven acoustics, built to carry secrets from one end to another. A servant could stand at the southern arch and murmur a name, and it would be heard in the northern alcove, 70 steps away. No shouting, no repeating, only once, because secrets, they said, should never echo. Some kings used it to test loyalty. They would speak a word and see who flinched. One queen used it to hear her own name spoken by others when they thought she'd gone. She said it was how she learned who loved her and who did not. The hall was not well lit, because shadows served the truth better than torches, and silence, they believed, needed space. You may feel it now, that sensation in your spine, that someone else has just whispered a word too softly to understand. That's the whisper hall working. Even now, let us step beyond, into the room of clocks. No clock in this room told the same time, not one. They ticked and chimed in chaos, some fast, some slow. One spun backwards. They were not broken. They were deliberate. This was the room where time was made unfamiliar, because to rule time, a monarch had to be above it. Queens held council here. Kings signed edicts here, but never when the hour made sense. One king signed a treaty at 3:47 in the morning. Another annulled a law during the 61st minute of an hour that should not have existed. They said it disoriented their enemies. That unpredictability was power, but it also disoriented their minds. Some left the room dizzy, others never quite left at all. One steward began to hear ticking even in sleep. He dreamed of minutes falling like rain. He spoke only in hours. They sent him away to a cloister where time stood still, and he was never confused again. Let that ticking fade. You don't need to measure this moment. It will carry you, not count you. Now come into the dressing crypt. Yes, a dressing room, but built underground, lit only by candlelight, with walls lined in obsidian mirrors. This was where queens dressed for mourning, not immediately after death, but before, because mourning began the moment a loved one became too quiet, too slow, too still. There were gowns stitched with grief, veils that had never seen sunlight, rings with hollow stones, to be filled with ashes later, and one chair, high-backed, never warm, where the queen sat while her hair was unbraided, each braid a memory, each pin a promise. When her husband died, the veil was already tied. When the child passed, the dress already hung, because nothing was sudden. Everything had been practiced, including sorrow. Now rise, softly, into the aviary library, a room where birds lived among books, scrolls stacked beside nests. Feathers littered the floor. Parrots recited law. Owls guarded sealed letters. One raven cawed only when lies were spoken. He was kept beside the royal scribe. A canary once sang through a trial. The judge ruled in favor of the song and was praised for listening to the wind. Books here were not bound. They were folded, tied with silk, hidden beneath cages. The air smelled of parchment and seed. Reading was never silent because the birds never stopped. Their sounds became part of the words. One queen said the birds reminded her that thoughts should fly. And so they did. We walk again, this time to the Tower of Sleep, a narrow spire with no windows on the first 3 floors. Only one door, only one occupant, a princess kept there to dream, not imprisoned, protected. It was believed she saw the future in dreams, and the farther she slept from the world, the clearer her visions became. Servants crept in and out like shadows. Food was passed without words. Books delivered through slits in the wall. She wrote her dreams on thin strips of cloth. They were hung like banners from the tower's peak, and read only when the moon was right. One predicted a famine, another a flood. One read simply, "The sea forgets." And that year, ships disappeared without cause. She never spoke, only slept and dreamed until she didn't, and the cloths stopped coming. The tower was sealed, not by order, but by fear, because no one wished to know what the last dream had been. Let that silence echo a little longer. You're still here, and so is the story, floating around you like ash that never lands. We could stop, but we won't. We never do, because the weirdness of royalty has no end, only deeper layers and softer edges. Let it pull you down gently, and when you close your eyes tonight, a silver key may appear, or a dress that smells like jasmine, in the dark, or a whisper bouncing from arch to arch. Don't hold on, just listen, just rest. The tale still moves. In the far reaches of the court, past the sunlit galleries and the throne-lined halls, stood a door few acknowledged and fewer dared approach. The wood was dark, so dark it drank the candlelight. No guard stood beside it, no seal hung above it, but every royal child was taught the name whispered by the dust around it, the chamber of unseen guests. This was not a place for humans. It was for presences, for forces that the court could not name, but still feared and still respected. Inside, the air was always cool, always still. No windows, only walls lined with veils. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, each embroidered with a name never spoken aloud. The veils moved without breeze. They lifted, trembled, whispered, sank. Only the royal family could enter, and even then, only alone. No one knew what was said inside, only that monarchs emerged different, quieter, more watchful. One king entered with a limp. He left walking straight. Another queen entered with a crown. She left wearing only a scarf. No one questioned it, because that was the room's rule. Question stayed at the door. Answers did not come out. Let the curtain fall gently in your mind now. Let that room stay dim and still and unvisited. We return now, not to the body, but to the breath, to the royal breath keeper, a title long forgotten by historians, but once very real. The breath keeper followed the king or queen at all times, during illness, grief, or spiritual unrest. Their role? To count and record every breath the monarch took. Each inhale was written on a scroll of lambskin, each exhale marked with ash. It was said that when the soul was unsettled, the breath would betray it. And so, watching breath was an act of loyalty. One queen's scroll of breaths ran over 30 feet. When she passed, the scroll was rolled into a spiral and buried beneath her bedchamber. Not a tomb, a bed, so that even in death, her breath would be remembered as sleep. Another monarch's final 400 breaths were painted onto tiles, each one glazed with a different mineral. When the tiles were laid on the palace floor, they shimmered under torchlight, a pattern of life walked upon daily, not out of disrespect, but remembrance. Let your breath slow now too. Inhale, exhale, and let the rhythm sink without thought. We drift now to the hall of unnamed paintings. A strange place, walls covered in portraits of people whose names were never recorded. Some had faces, others had blank ovals where eyes and mouths should be. Some were painted in gold, some entirely in ash. No one knew who had commissioned the works. They simply appeared. One painting showed a woman holding a lily made of wax. Another, a man with one blue eye and one eye made of mirror. The mirror eye reflected whoever stood before it. Visitors said it blinked. The portraits changed subtly over time. A child's smile widened. A knight's sword shortened. One queen claimed the paintings were memories too dangerous to write down. So they had been painted instead. To forget safely, the hall was silent, so silent that footsteps seemed swallowed before they landed. No artist ever signed the works, but the pigments matched no known region. Some glowed faintly in moonlight, others faded when touched by morning. A page once snuck inside after midnight. He was found days later, asleep beneath the portrait of a veiled man with no hands. He would never speak again, but he would draw strange shapes, faces with mouths sewn shut, eyes shaped like suns. The queen kept his drawings locked in a copper box sealed with red wax. She said they belonged to the future, and the future wasn't ready. Now let your eyes grow soft, like the fading of color on those ancient canvases. Let memory dissolve into shape, not meaning. We come now to the Royal Bell Garden, a place where bells grew, not from branches, but from ropes and vines, strung from carved wooden frames. Each bell was cast in a different metal: tin for laughter, copper for sadness, bronze for shame, silver for devotion, gold for change. They were not rung with hands, but by the wind, and only when the wind came from the north. The bell garden was considered sacred. Queens walked it barefoot. Kings in mourning walked it cloaked. Children of the court were not allowed to speak inside it. They were only allowed to listen, because each bell told a story, not in words, but in tone. It was said that a bell that rang without wind foretold betrayal. One such bell rang for 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, the treasurer disappeared. No one looked for him. The bell had spoken, and that was enough. A blind servant once said she could see the bells. Each had a color, she said, even when her eyes saw nothing. The blue bells mourned children. The red bells sang of war. The white ones whispered love letters. Let those tones drift over you now. You don't need to hear them. Only feel the spaces they make, the pauses, the hush between chimes. Now we walk, very slowly, into the room of forgotten feasts. It sat beneath the kitchens, a room prepared for dinners that were never served. Tables set with plates of stone and wax fruit, cups of dyed water, seats labeled with names that never existed. Why? No one truly knew. Some believed the feasts were rehearsals. Others said they were offerings or apologies or illusions meant to mislead spirits who wandered the palace. One tale claimed a king once threw a feast in this room for his regrets. He dined in silence, spoke to no one, raised his cup only to his own reflection in the wine, and when he left, the servants claimed the seats stayed warm for days. Another monarch hosted a feast there once a year. He would dine in silence with masks seated beside him. Each mask represented a version of himself he'd never become: the warrior, the father, the madman. He said it helped him choose which self to feed and which to starve. Let that image soften into silence. A long table, empty chairs, forks that never lift. Now drift further into a space you've never imagined. The hall of clocks that only move backward an entire corridor of timepieces that reverse. They tick against reason. They chime before the hour begins. It was said the hall was used to revisit decisions, to unmake choices. One queen walked it daily in her later years. She said each step made her younger in spirit. Another king banned it entirely. Said it backward, time tempted the soul. But some still went, mostly at night, mostly barefoot. They walked in silence, backwards, hoping to unstep something painful, to undo a word, unlive a regret. But no matter how far they walked, morning always came, because even backward clocks can't erase dawn. Now let that corridor close behind you and find yourself in the final chamber for now, the room of windless tapestries. No one could explain them. They moved softly, though no air stirred. The tapestries showed scenes that changed depending on the season. In spring, they showed birth. In summer, celebration. In autumn, sorrow. And in winter, only fog. The images never repeated. One showed a queen holding a bird made of smoke. Another, a man kneeling before a tree with eyes. One queen wept when a tapestry showed her as a child. Another king swore when he saw his brother's death appear weeks before it happened. The tapestries were not painted or stitched. They were grown, spun from fibers of plants no longer known. Some say the weavers were buried beneath the floor, their hearts still beating, feeding the thread. Others said the cloth remembered, not the future or past, but everything between. A seamstress once touched one with a needle. The tapestry bled. She was sent away with honors and a quiet warning. That memory does not enjoy being pierced. Now rest. Now let all these images become haze. You don't need to remember each. They will linger without your effort. This world, this soft, strange world of royalty, has no firm borders. It bends with your breath. It settles with your sleep. And even as your thoughts slow, the story continues. Always. There was a room in some castles where no one was allowed to speak of birth. It was not forbidden by law, only by custom. A room made not of joy, but of waiting. They called it the mother's passage, but it had no mother inside. Only chairs with worn arms and cushions filled with dried herbs, lavender, sage, myrrh. The windows were small and high, so that the women seated below could not see the sky, because birth for royalty was not celestial. It was shadowed, a moment caught between triumph and death, too often both. The women of the court waited here during labor. They held hands. They prayed, not aloud, but in gesture, a tilted head, a pressed thumb, a breath drawn and held. When the child was born, a candle was either lit or extinguished in the hallway. One queen refused candles altogether. She said light lied, so the message came by scent. If the newborn lived, someone scattered rose petals. If not, the hallway smelled of vinegar. One duchess gave birth to silence, not death, not life, just no cry. She did not ask questions. She only went to the chapel and sat beneath a carving of a weeping angel with a broken wing. She stayed there until her hair turned gray. No one followed her, and no one cleaned the petals from the hallway. Let that hush settle into your thoughts. Let it lie down like mist on stone. We drift now into the strangest of royal spaces, the vault of unspoken prayers. This was not a church. It was not even a chapel. It was a box, a stone room buried far beneath the castle. Inside, no icons, no benches, only a single lectern and a book with blank pages. No ink, no pen, only the rule. Whisper your prayer, then turn the page. No one knew who began the tradition, but it was said that each whispered prayer left a trace, a warmth in the page, a ripple in the parchment. One queen descended each month. She prayed with closed eyes. When asked what for, she said, "The part of me I don't show." After she died, her pages were warmest of all. A king visited once in his youth, and never again. He said the silence answered too loudly. Another noble never went at all. He wrote his prayers in the dirt behind the stables. He said the horses were better at keeping secrets than stones. The book remains, untouched by time. No one dares write upon it, but every monarch since has turned one page, even if they had nothing left to whisper. Let your breath deepen. Now, even the quiet has weight. We come now to the banquet of masks, an annual feast not for celebration, but for forgetting. Each attendee wore a mask, not to conceal identity, but to abandon it. No one was addressed by name, only by color. Red, for the guest with a ruby-eyed mask shaped like a fox. Gold, for the one who wore the sun and laughed only once. Glass, for the one whose mask reflected every face but her own. The food was symbolic. Salted plums for sorrow, burnt bread for memory, a single boiled egg, uncut, untouched, for the child never born. The feast lasted hours. There was no music, only footsteps, only chewing, only the soft rustle of robes and thought. At the end, the masks were placed on silver trays, each one cracked in half, buried at the edge of the garden under moonlight. One year, a guest refused to break their mask. They walked into the forest and were not seen again. But birds began nesting in the trees with crimson feathers, and so the forest was left alone. Let that feast fade. You're not expected to understand it, only to feel its silence stretch like a tablecloth across time. We drift now to the sanctum of second thoughts, not a place, but a ritual. Royal decrees were final, written in ink, made from iron and oak gall, sealed with wax, stamped with rings that bore lions and dragons and towers. But sometimes a ruler regretted, and when they did, they followed the path to the sanctum, a hallway lined with mirrors that did not reflect, not truly. They shimmered, yes. They showed movement, yes. But no face could be seen, only silhouettes. The path was long, long enough for second thoughts to settle, like dust, if, by the end, The monarch still held the decree in hand. They burned it. No words, no ceremony, just fire, and the decree was erased from memory. Even the scribes were not told. Only the ashes remained, swept into the corners. A queen walked the path 17 times in her reign. She never said what she changed, but each time the garden grew a new flower, one that no one had planted. Another king never walked it once. He died with his regrets folded beside his bed. The paper had turned brittle, unreadable, because even unburned, parchment forgets. Let those ashes swirl. They are not yours to carry. Now, slowly, we step into the chamber of quiet music. Here, musicians played without audience, harps strummed gently by candlelight, lutes tuned but never sung with, drums brushed with fingers, not sticks. The sound barely rose above a breath. The chamber was not meant to be entered, only passed beside. Its sound spilled into the hallway, just enough for those walking by to forget what they were going to say, just enough for quarrels to soften, just enough for guilt to find pause. One king slept with his bedchamber adjacent to it. He said the softest music reached his dreams and rewrote them. Another queen never stepped near it. She feared her secrets would rise into the melody and become song. The chamber still plays. The instruments are touched by hands unseen, and no dust ever gathers, because music, even faint, stirs the air. Now breathe with it, gently, like a string being drawn, but never released. Let go of thought. Let go of shape, because now we walk into the tower of misremembered names, high above the main keep, accessed only by a narrow spiral stair. Here, the walls are etched with names, thousands, maybe more, but none match records. These names don't belong to kings or queens or generals. They belong to those who might have been, servants lost to history, midwives who held the future in their hands and never knew it, guards who saw too much and forgot just enough. One name simply reads, the one who waited. Another, she of the green ribbon. Another, almost. The tower hums in windless nights. Some say the names shift. Others say new ones appear, etched while no one watches. A monk tried to catalog them once. He gave up after the ink from his quill dried into salt. Let those names stay where they are. Don't hold them. They are not yours to claim, only to pass gently by. And now, finally for this moment, we settle near the table of undone crowns, a place where unfinished crowns were kept. Some were too heavy, some lacked a single gem, others were forged for rulers who never ascended. Each was placed on a velvet pillow, and no one touched them. To wear one was to invite the unfinished fate. A girl once ran through the room as a child. She touched one crown, and later in life, she chose silence over rule, said the metal had whispered. A boy dreamed of the crowns every night. He was sent to the chapel to forget, but he painted them in ash on the chapel walls. Even now, if the light strikes just so, you can see the outline, a crown with no peak, No weight, only shape, only waiting. Let it rest. Let yourself rest. The royal world is not done, but you don't need to follow. You only need to float alongside it. Each step has meaning, even those you don't remember, even those made in sleep. And now we sleep, but the story continues, softly, somewhere beneath the older parts of the castle, deeper than the wine cellars, beyond the reach of candlelight, lay a hallway that narrowed the longer you walked it. They called it the passage of shrinking silence. No measurements existed. It wasn't drawn on maps, but it was there. The walls came closer the farther you moved forward, as if time pressed inward, as if memory itself grew narrower. No one spoke inside it, not because of fear, but because of the rules. The hallway demanded stillness, and for centuries, royals used it when a decision had become too loud in their minds. When noise clung to their ribs, they'd descend alone, carrying a single candle in a glass bowl. At the end of the passage was a chair. No throne, just a chair of old wood, curved by centuries of breath. Here they sat, not to think, not to reflect, but to forget, briefly, who they were outside the stone. Many rulers came back changed. One queen stopped sleeping in silk and began wearing wool. Another stopped using mirrors, said the hallway had shown her enough. No one knew what was at the very end. Some said a mirror so black it swallowed names. Others said just a wall, damp and smooth, with no reflection, no return. But most never reached the end. They sat in the chair, and when the candle flickered low, they rose, quieter, not wiser, not clearer, just slower. Let that passage stretch through you now, dim and narrowing, like thought at the edge of a dream. We move now to the room of unfinished games. It sat beside the guest quarters, a place for courtly diversions. Chessboards, missing queens, dice with no numbers, card decks painted with symbols no one remembered. The nobles gathered here in pairs, never alone. The rule was simple. You could start a game, but never finish one. It was said that endings cursed the chamber. To complete a game meant someone would lose more than a point. So moves were made slowly, purposely interrupted. Conversations wandered. Hands hesitated. One lady in waiting played a game of chess that lasted 14 years. When she died, her opponent moved her final pawn forward, and the floor beneath him cracked. He never played again. A prince invented a new game there once. He never told the rules, only played against himself. When asked who was winning, he said, "Whoever remembers less." Another visitor found a set of carved animal tokens. He played them with a foreign ambassador. They never agreed on the rules, and yet both claimed victory. Their kingdoms stayed at peace. Somehow, let that game linger unfinished in your thoughts. No winner, no loser, just the quiet thrill of not knowing what comes next. Now we rise gently to the canopy of forgotten voices. Not a room, not even a structure, but a series of gauzy drapes strung above one of the royal balconies. High up, above the court, The wind passed through the fabric in such a way that it carried the softest echoes. Laughter from the garden, footsteps from the chapel, sighs from the queen's own throat, returned minutes later, lighter, quieter, strange. They said the fabric collected forgotten words, and some nights, if the moon was high and the tapestries wet with dew, you could hear them. Old conversations, lost lullabies, last words. Once, a king stood beneath the canopy during a storm. He heard his mother's voice. She had died years before. He did not weep. He only removed his crown and left it on the balcony rail. It stayed there 3 days before the wind took it. The queen who followed never wore a crown again. She said rulership required listening, not metal. Let that breeze move through you now, soft and shapeless, like a voice you used to know. We walk now to the chamber of royal doubles. This room had mirrors, but none showed the viewer. Each one reflected someone else. A twin, they said, a version of the monarch that lived another life. One mirror showed a king with no crown working in the stables. Another, a queen as a baker's daughter, arms dusted with flour. There were rules. Only 3 mirrors could be looked at in one visit, and no questions were to be asked. If you lingered too long, the reflection blinked, not always in rhythm, not always kindly. One mirror showed a version of the prince that aged in reverse. Another, a queen with no mouth, only eyes. It was said that to find a version of yourself that smiled too easily meant your current life had gone wrong. One ruler smashed his mirror. A replacement appeared the next morning, with the same image and the same smile. No one tried again. Let those mirrors fade now. Let them fog over. You don't need to see yourself reflected tonight. We move further, deeper, to the sanctuary of misspoken words. A chapel with no altar, only walls, etched with phrases that had once been said in error. Proclamations never meant, declarations that turned kingdoms, whispers that ended trust. Each word was carved by candlelight, one per night, no more. Each carving required silence. One scribe worked here all her life. When she died, the final word was always. No one knew why. The phrases were written in many tongues, some forgotten, some imagined, but their meanings hung in the air. You didn't have to understand them. You could feel them. Some walls made your throat tighten. Others made you yawn. Some made you remember things that never happened. The royals came here after arguments, after executions, after vows spoken in haste. They did not pray. They only stood, long enough for the words to shift slightly on the wall, as if deciding whether to forgive. Let those words dissolve now, not erased, only exhaled. And finally, tonight, we return to the chamber of stilled water, an indoor pool, never for swimming, still as glass, reflecting not the ceiling, but the past. Yes, the surface showed what had already happened, but not just to the viewer, to the palace, to the halls, to the land. A queen once saw the founding of her dynasty, her ancestor on horseback, raising a flag stitched with a lion missing its tail. She wept, not from pride, but because the lion never meant to roar, only to walk beside. Another monarch saw himself sleeping, not now, but years ago. He realized he had been followed all his life by eyes he couldn't see. He closed the chamber for a decade. When it reopened, the water had darkened, but still it showed, and still it whispered, because even silence leaves a wake. Let that stillness settle in your limbs, the surface of the mind unbroken. No questions, no reflections, only drift, only breath. The story does not pause here. It moves on in quiet loops and hidden chambers. And you are welcome to rest as long as needed, even as it continues without you, because it always does. In one forgotten corner of a royal fortress, behind layers of stone, past a spiral staircase where moss grew in the creases, there was a room they called the Vault of Shadows that stayed. It was not dark, but the light inside behaved differently. Torches burned without flicker, candles stood impossibly still, and the shadows on the walls did not move. Even when you did, they stayed where they had first been cast, as if remembering the people who had stood there long ago, as if clinging to memory, not light. Some claimed the room held the shadows of ancient kings and queens, moments frozen, gestures half finished. One could walk beside a shadow with a hand lifted, always mid-sentence. Another showed a queen on her knees, praying, begging. No one knew. The air was always cold, and voices echoed longer than expected, but only in whispers. Louder speech was swallowed entirely. The royals visited rarely, only when loss sat too heavily on their chests. The room didn't give answers, only presence, and presence, in grief, was often enough. Let those shadows settle around you now. You don't need to see them clearly, just know they're still there. We move now to the room of melted timepieces. Every hourglass here was warped, glass bent like soft wax. Sand within it sometimes flowed upward, sometimes sideways. Clocks in this room ticked once, then paused for a long, thoughtful moment, then ticked again. No time here could be trusted, which made it the most honest room of all. Royal advisors came here when decisions were too urgent. They'd sit among the twisted brass and tilted dials and wait. They said that in this room, the feeling of time passed more truthfully than the measure of it. One queen brought her midwife here before labor. She said the child must be born between the seconds. He was born without cry, without pain, as though time itself had forgotten to tighten its grip. He grew slowly, but remembered everything, even before speech. Another monarch hid here during war. The clocks hid him too. No one could track how long he stayed, only that when he emerged, his beard had grown, but the moon outside was still the same. He claimed time had wept for him, and in return, he ruled gently for the rest of his years. Let your sense of time drift now. It is not needed, only the rhythm of your breath. In, out. No ticking required. We move now to the sanctuary of silver dust, a domed chamber beneath the library. It was lined with ledges, narrow shelves that caught the falling dust of ancient books stored above. The dust was not ordinary. It shimmered faintly, silver in low light. It was believed that the dust carried remnants of the words that had once been written on decayed pages. When enough gathered on a ledge, scribes would collect it with soft brushes and mix it into ink. This ink was used only for letters never sent. Royal children wrote apologies to people they had never wronged. Queens wrote farewell notes to ancestors they had never met. Kings wrote confessions with no addressee. The act of writing was enough. The letters were never folded, only placed beneath a sheet of beeswax, then burned at dawn. One princess wrote the same letter every week. She did not change a word, but each time she wrote, a different feather fell onto her windowsill. Peacock, crow, dove. No one knew who she wrote to, only that, by the time she married, her letters had stopped, and her window stayed closed. Let that silver dust drift through your mind. No need to hold the words. They're meant to disappear. We now step softly into the gallery of drowned portraits, a corridor flooded just ankle deep in water. Its walls hung with paintings sealed behind glass. Not frames, glass, because the paintings were submerged, not only in the shallow water, but in memory. Each portrait depicted a royal figure, not in life, but at their lowest, their most forgotten, their most feared. One king was painted with closed eyes, weeping black ink. A queen stood in a snowstorm, barefoot, bleeding from her palms. Another noble knelt before an empty throne. The water that pooled on the floor was salt-kissed, from time, from tears, perhaps both. Visitors moved carefully, so as not to ripple the water too much, because when the water stilled, the portraits whispered, only faintly, just enough to make the hair on your arms lift. One prince stood here every year on the same day. His birthday. He said the portraits told him who he might still become. He left soaked to the knees, but lighter, and never ruled with cruelty. Let those reflections soften now. The water, the whispers, the portraits, all fading into thoughtless ripples. We drift now to the chamber of ceremonies that never happened, a strange theater, neither grand nor plain. Inside were altars never used, banners for events that had been canceled, chairs arranged for coronations that had never taken place. Everything prepared, nothing completed. Here stood a cradle, carved with sunbursts that had waited for an heir who never arrived, a wedding arch woven with dried roses, still intact, beneath which no vows had been spoken. There were robes tailored for processions that were rained out, crowns sized for heads that were never crowned. One king kept this room preserved as is, dust allowed to fall, but nothing ever moved. He said the room reminded him that plans were not promises, that intention was not destiny. When he died, his son added a sculpture, a table set for three, with only two chairs. No explanation given, only a card that read, "For what might have been, let that emptiness pass through you. It does not need filling, only honoring." And finally, tonight, we climb to the observatory of reversed stars, a tower room with a domed ceiling, painted in constellations, but mirrored. North, where south should be, Leo tangled in the sea, Orion drifting backward through time. Astronomers came here not to chart, but to unlearn, to see the sky not as it was, but as it could have been. They called it the sky of forgotten futures. Here, queens predicted rain without clouds. Kings foresaw peace during war. One child of the court climbed to the observatory and refused to descend for weeks. He named new stars, gave them names like Linger and Almost, and She Waits. They charted nothing, but their presence made the room warmer, softer. One prince made his decisions only after standing beneath that painted dome. He said when the stars were reversed, the truth became simpler, not clearer, just softer. And soft truth, he believed, was enough to rule kindly. Let that ceiling curve over you now. You are not under it. You are inside it. Let the stars reverse. Let the constellations dissolve. You do not need the heavens to sleep, only the stillness they inspire. The world of royalty, its strangeness, its softness, its sorrow, continues, but you don't need to follow. Not tonight. Let your breath deepen. Let the halls stretch behind you, and let the story continue without end. There was a practice, long hidden and nearly forgotten, known only as the Royal Silence Fast, not a ritual of monks, not a vow of speechlessness for the sake of virtue, but a tradition held by monarchs once every 7 years. For 7 nights, the king or queen would say nothing, no words, no nods, not even a glance with meaning. They would eat alone, sleep in a chamber lined with woolen drapes to absorb sound. And in this span of stillness, their court watched them closely, not for what they would say, but for what they had become. The purpose was not confession, but rebalancing. One monarch emerged from the silence fast with hands ink-stained and eyes rimmed with salt. She burned all the proclamations she'd signed the year before and reissued them softer. Another took the silence into his bones. Never truly spoke the same way again. His words became half whispers, his decrees written in verse. They called him the Murmuring King, and under him the realm grew quiet and kind. No one recorded the dreams that came during silence fasts. It was said they weren't dreams at all, but memories from other lives, layered faintly over the skin like ash. You may imagine now what that silence would feel like. Not absence, but presence, loud with thought and wordless mercy. And let yourself rest in it too. We step gently now into the hall of draped portraits, a long corridor of tapestries and paintings, each one covered with fine cloth, not to protect them, but to protect the viewer. The faces beneath were not horrific, only too honest. Each work had been created during moments of emotional rupture, painted not to flatter or inspire legacy, but to hold truth when truth felt unmanageable. A young queen with tears on her collarbones, holding a letter she'd never send, a prince gazing at an empty ring box, a ruler mid-scream, mouth agape, eyes wet, against a background of rose petals and mud. These portraits were not burned or buried, only hidden, viewed only on the night before a coronation. It was believed that to see your ancestors' true faces, even briefly, cleansed the soul of ambition. One princess lifted a cloth too early. She painted her own version in secret, hung it in the servants' corridor, unsigned. When she ascended, her rule was marked by absence. No feasts, no sculptures, only policies written with clean edges and no names attached. Some said she had removed herself from history. Others believed she had expanded it, quiet and wide, like water. Let those cloths rest now, unlifted. You don't need to see every sorrow to feel its shape. We pass softly to the larder of forgotten flavors, not a place for the hungry, a vault kept behind the palace kitchens, where ancient spices and long-lost herbs were stored. In silence, glass bottles of crumbled seeds no longer grown, corked vials of powders imported once, then banned for reasons unstated. One shelf held only shadow fruit, a dried berry from a faraway mountain, said to change the eater's mood with every taste. No, two bites the same. Another corner stored stone rind, a root that, when steeped in hot water, made you weep for places you'd never been. No chef entered here without permission. The steward of the larder wore robes of heavy linen, dyed with onion skin and beetroot, symbolic of taste, grief, and time. Once per season, a dish was prepared from this larder for the monarch, served alone, on black porcelain, with no explanation. The queen who once ate stone rind wrote letters for 3 days, then burned them all. The king who sampled the dust of blue fire, stem cancelled, a war. He would later say he tasted the fire his soldiers would have died in. Let that imagined taste touch your tongue now, not bitter, not sweet, only unfamiliar. We drift to the narrow chapel of lost names, a place smaller than a corridor, longer than a room. Its walls were etched, not with saints or angels, but with names scraped in crooked lines. They belonged to children never born, lovers never married, advisors never listened to, ideas never voiced. Each name hummed faintly when the wind crossed the slotted windows, like a breath taken and not released. A monarch would visit here alone on their birthday and sit on a bench carved with the word almost. It was not sadness they felt, only scale, a reminder of what hadn't been, of how large a life might have become. One queen added a name each year, a name of a part of herself she no longer was. By the end of her reign, her wall was full, and she said, with a quiet smile, I'm only who's left. Let that quiet smile pass through you. You are not all you've been, and that is mercy. Now we climb the marble spiral to the tower of dimming lanterns. This was where royal regrets were sent, not written or spoken, but breathed into small paper lanterns. Each lantern held a tiny curl of the monarch's own hair, a whisper of ink on its inner wall. No one read the writing. That was the rule. At dusk, the tower was opened, and a single lantern floated out from the window. It did not fly. It drifted, slow, like sorrow, like forgiveness waiting for no answer. The lanterns were never retrieved, but tales said they sometimes returned, months, years later, carried by river or hawk or wind. One monarch received her own lantern on the eve of her death. She read the message she had written so many decades ago. It read, "I never meant to say no." She passed smiling. Let that lantern drift into your own sky. You don't have to read it, only let it rise. And now we settle in a most curious place, the sanctum of the monarch's laugh, a room rarely entered. It contained no mirrors, no throne, only a chair carved from apple wood, and on the far wall, a silver bell. The bell was rung only once in a lifetime, when a monarch laughed freely, fully, for the first time after becoming ruler. It could not be forced, nor manufactured. If it came, it came, and the bell would sing so softly that only the stone could truly hear it. Not all monarchs rang the bell. One ruled for 42 years and never entered the room. Another found it by accident and laughed just as the door opened. The bell did not ring for her. She said it already had. A third sat for hours, hoping. He never laughed, but he wept, and the bell rang anyway. Let that soft chime settle into your spine. You don't need to laugh tonight. You only need to breathe and let the echo find you. As the royal world darkens around you, not in danger, but in velvet, remember, you are walking halls built for reflection, and in every room, some part of the self waits patiently, not loudly, not urgently, just there. We continue, we drift, and soon we'll arrive at the final stretch of this story. But for now, there is still one more path, and the footsteps are already beginning. The light is almost gone, but not lost. What remains is enough. Let it carry you through the last doorway, at the farthest end of the palace, where no blueprints reached, and where the marble gave way to wood worn smooth by centuries of slow footsteps. There was a single door. It was smaller than the others. No guards stood by it. No candles burned near it. Only a thin line of daylight bled beneath the frame. Not the sunlight of the outside world, but something gentler, as if it had passed through memory to reach you. This was the entrance to the last room. It had no name, but it waited. Every monarch entered it once, and only once. Not at the moment of death, but before the last letter was signed, before the final speech was given, before the heir was named. Inside, there were no walls, only fog and the smell of lavender and aged wood and linen warmed by breath. Some said it was a dream built into the stone itself. Others claimed it was a memory from the first king, passed down like a final lullaby. Those who returned never spoke of what they saw, but afterward their steps slowed, their voices softened, and their crowns, though still heavy, sat more gently upon their heads. One queen returned with a small stone in her hand. She kept it beside her bed until her final hour. A prince emerged with salt on his cheek. He claimed it had rained in the room, not outside, just inside. One ruler never came back out, not in body, but a letter appeared beneath his pillow the next morning. It read only, "I remembered who I was before the crown, and so, as our story fades, not ends, you may imagine this room now, not for kings, not for queens, but for you, a place at the quiet heart of your own palace, where the noise ceases, where the mirrors rest, where nothing must be said, because everything is already understood. Breathe now. You've walked far. The chambers stretch behind you like dreams you've already begun to forget. And ahead, only silence, only peace, only the soft hum of something old and kind, waiting. And so, the story doesn't finish. It simply goes quiet. Good night.